first feature we will show is the support for ARRI LogC4. What's interesting about this camera is that ARRI have introduced new color science. So what we are looking at, it's dual view, where one output from the camera is the SDI, regular SDI output, outputting new ARRI LogC4. And in the second view, we have this special SDI output from the ARRI camera, which is outputting so-called wireless video optimized mode. So when switching between these two views, you can see one is the log and the other says WVO. This is a special mode that ARRI created in order to transfer more of image detail over the wireless connection. What they are basically doing is they are shifting a part of the range of the image into brighter area, which is less affected. That way it's less affected by the wireless video transfer. On the left side, it's regular LogC4. On the right side, you have to pick wireless video optimized. And now you can see that the images are the same, right? So QTAKE is applying inverse LUT automatically when this color space is selected. But why are we dealing with logarithmic color space at all is because of the false color filter that we will show a bit later. Okay, so let's move on, and while we are in the project window, we'll show another feature that's probably more useful for DIT side of work, but nevertheless, it's a new feature in QTAKE where you can deal with canvas. Basically, in QTAKE so far, canvas was always the same as the input signal. So if you're receiving HD signal, your canvas, where you're painting your image, was also 1920 by 1080. But if you want to export dailies, let's say you need to export a different aspect ratio. You all know that Netflix is using 2:1, or maybe sometimes you want to export 1 to 2.4 anamorphic kind of aspect ratio. This wasn't really possible because you could only see the black bars on top or on the bottom. Mario has here a couple of clips which are shot. Every clip is in different aspect ratio, all coming from ARRI camera. And as you can imagine, they are all just centered to fit on your existing canvas, which is based on input. So it's HD resolution. However, now if we go to project window, we can set it to clip. So your canvas size will change based on the clips, right? So now when loading the clips, your canvas will match the clip resolution, clip aspect ratio, right? So in case, for example, you just want to simply export, every clip will be exported in its native aspect ratio. But there is also a custom mode, which is probably more interesting, because if you're shooting a project, you will probably end up with a single format of deliverables, let's say anamorphic aspect ratio, 1920 by 800. And you can see that your canvas has changed the aspect, and now whatever you load in, it will match this canvas, and you need to do pattern scan. You basically need to apply DVE and transform your image to match this deliverable format. So let's go back to ARRI color space, new false color effect, which works in the logarithmic color space. So there is a zero setup. Basically, you just need to turn it on because it's all based on the metadata received over SDI. As you may know, false color in ARRI cameras is dependent on the exposure index, right? So when we turn on the false color, if Mario changes the exposure index, you will see that the highlights and shadows are changing, right? Which is blue and red color. You just need to follow the colors as specified by ARRI. It's the same thing would happen inside the camera. You would see the same effect if you apply false color in the camera, but now we can do it in QTAKE to show it to DP, let's say, important filter when setting the exposure. Next, we will focus on the UI improvements. First thing is a simple feature where we just wanted to make it quicker to control list if you're using the mouse. As you know, historically QTAKE interface was focusing more on the touchscreen aspect of it, but more and more people are using mouse or trackpad. So now you can use right click to quickly get to either directly to the function of the selected clip, or you can, let's say, select quickly all takes. So based on the first take that was right clicked, you can select quickly all takes and let's say export them to PDF or whatever other function, right? So it's just an improvement for operators that are more comfortable with the mouse. Next one is a GPU out improvement. This is the new option. Full area is the new option. This is the former way of how QTAKE was displaying multi-view. It was basically dividing your screen real estate in equal parts and putting the image in the center of those parts, which created this ugly gap between two views. Now, when you turn it off, and this is a new default, images are stacked nicely on top of each other. This of course works even in non-rotated mode. Maybe, yeah, it's visible, for example, in this widescreen format. You all know that if you need to do something on the machine while QTAKE is running, you have to hide QTAKE, because QTAKE is working in so-called kiosk mode, like an ATM machine. Basically, it's covering the whole screen. And if you want to access some system controls, just to click hide. And now you can open your Finder, emails, or whatever. What's bad about that is that you don't keep the track of what's going on. Now, if you long click hide button and click hide again, there is a separate window which is showing all your views. This is not just static thumbnails. Mario can go back to QTAKE and play it back or switch to live input. And this video window will show you at all times what's going on with your views, right? So even with hidden QTAKE, you can keep an eye on what is going on, if the camera has been disconnected or maybe your playback has finished in the meantime. And of course, this is resizable and you can minimize it. So it's a nice little pop-up window when QTAKE is hidden. And the last feature in the UI realm is the new so-called UI output. Sometimes there is a need to actually output a part of QTAKE interface. Let's say it can be useful when you're streaming and you want to share this QR code so that the crew can scan it. Now you can click this circular icon in the right bottom corner of most of the windows and you can share them, right? You can maybe share the clip browser so the script supervisor can see what you are browsing from. You can share maybe LUT browser with the DP when you want to apply LUT. There are some situations where you would want to share whatever you are controlling with some of the crew which is not sitting, behind you. Control is easy. Basically, you just click this icon, and if you want to route it to a different output, just make that view active and long click the UI output. And now it will be routed to that output, right? So let's move to audio. There's a new mute live audio control where you can control how this live audio is previewed, right? So in the past, there was only automatic muting based on playback, right? So when you went to playback, live signal would mute, and the only way you could control is whether whether this muting is dependent on all views or only one view, right? So now we added a new option where you can control muting live audio based on recording. Sometimes if you are recording, you want to mute audio so it doesn't interfere, doesn't create audio feedback, right? So you can set the live muting to be triggered by recording, or you want to trigger it by actually not recording, right? Because sometimes you have director talking to actor and sound mixer is picking this all up, and you don't want to distribute this audio. This is a feature that we already had in streaming, where you could say, okay, I want to hear live audio only when not recording, but this is now extended to general audio monitoring, live monitoring. And or you can mute inputs always. Let's say your main audio is coming over first input, so you keep only that input active, and all the others you may want to mute so that you avoid some flange or slight echo, because these signals can be out of phase, especially when using embedded audio on every SDI input, right? So the new option, on every input independently, you can control whether it is always muted, on recording or not recording. And also in terms of auto muting triggered by playback, there is now option to exclude some of the views from this trigger, right? So let's say you're using your view number 4 to playback something to VFX crew or script supervisor. You don't want this playback to trigger muting of the live audio because it's usually always on playback, right? So we will exclude view 3, view 4 from the controlling your live mute, and that way only view number 1, view number 2 will trigger live mute when switched to disk. And of course you can always control whether all included views or any included view will trigger muting, because you don't want your playback audio to be mixed with your live audio, right? So now there is a comprehensive control over this. Next one is playback. There have been improvements in playback in terms of there are two main features. One is the new looping, which now has a counter, right? So in addition of switching the looping mode, where it is Pong or loop mode, you can now have a counter and have your loop repeat 2-3 times. And there's also a new feature called stop action, which allows you to automatically switch to live or go to start. You all know that when simulating off-speed, QTAKE has been only duplicating frames. So if you want to simulate slow motion, you can go and set the speed to 25 or whatever %, and this is how it would look like, basically stuttering, right? There's a new mode now called frame blend, where we are doing real-time dissolve between consecutive frames. Maybe Mario, you could blow it up to full screen so we can see how this looks like with frame blending. And the last one is Optical Flow. So now go back from full screen and long click the frame blend button. As you can see, this is something that needs rendering, but the rendering is basically only analyzing motion vectors. Once the motion vectors are calculated, which happens in the background, then you can do whatever in the meantime. You can, let's say, you can select all your off-speed shots and have the motion analysis performed in the background, optical flow analysis. Once this is done, you can play back with Optical Flow. And as you can see, this off-speed looks much better. The last two features, the biggest features of this release, one is security related, and that was the last missing checkbox on the huge list of security demands from studios, and that's the forensic watermarking. So now directly in QTAKE you can do forensic watermarking simply with a single checkbox. It is turned on per stream, so per client. Some customers, maybe you have a DP connected to this, maybe DP doesn't have to have forensic watermark. This will be all dictated and mandated by productions or studios, and they will let you know who needs to be watermarked and who doesn't need to be. One great thing is that it works also on the local network, right? It doesn't need the cloud. You need cloud only to log in, and the process of logging in will enable forensic watermarking for that customer. It is something that we are adding to the list of other security features that we have, such as regular visible watermark and also screenshot protection, which is working on the system level. Yeah, Mario, you can demonstrate it. If you now hide QTAKE, you will see that screen capture is not allowed, so even Zoom cannot stream the view of QTAKE monitor, right? If the screenshot permission is turned off, right? But of course, you can still take your camera and record the screen of whatever playback device is being used, and that's why studios are demanding forensic watermarking, which can detect who was the one leaking the footage. Yeah, and this is the indicator. Since the forensic watermark is invisible, we are putting this little overlay icon, which indicates that the view has forensic watermark enabled. Yeah, in case you want to see the demo of the detection itself, I think Nagra, which is the supplier of this technology, will be showcasing this at NAB, HPA, and other shows they attend. But this will be usually on the side of the studio anyway, right? If there is a leak, they will detect the footage for forensic watermarking. This will generate the ID, which is traceable in our database to a specific user. So what is Dolby Vision? You all know it's basically a technology that is supposed to give you the best picture from HDR master on any kind of monitor. So what happens in the background is basically content mapping from your master, HDR master, which can be created, let's say, for 2000 nit HDR monitor. And you can control this all in QTAKE. So you can select the Dolby Vision mode, which is now version 2.9 and 4.0. You set your mastering monitor in case you are actually grading for HDR in QTAKE, but most of the time you will be just receiving HDR graded signal from DIT. So you will be setting the target in case, let's say, you want to output HDR and simultaneously SDR, right? So from DIT, you're getting HDR signal. In this case, we have loaded HDR clip. And on the left side, well, you don't see it through the Zoom. Zoom doesn't support HDR, right? But if you're running this on the MacBook, you can see bright HDR image. Or you can even you can set your HDMI output to Dolby Vision in QTAKE. So if you're using HDMI card, set the Dolby Vision output, and when connected to Dolby Vision TV, you can see the Dolby Vision logo, which means that all the Dolby Vision metadata is embedded in the signal. But what is more interesting is your non-HDR monitor, which so far you needed some kind of external equipment that will do the content mapping from HDR to SDR. And now you can do it, thanks to Dolby Vision technology, you can do it in QTAKE. So you just set your target monitor to SDI in your project settings and set this output, in this case V out, to iCMU, so-called internal content mapping unit, right? We can also set our view number to iCMU so that in this case, we don't see the external monitor, but we can see it in QTAKE. So you can see now, as Mario is turning on and off, this is basically how SDR down mapping looks like based on automatic conversion by Dolby Vision, right? On top of that, there is a new Dolby Vision effect, which is introducing Dolby Vision trims, right? So in this case, you can maybe do some tweaking, some adjustments. Maybe the result of the automatic conversion is not exactly what you want, right? Or your DP wants. QTAKE, as far as we know, is the first one who brings real-time Dolby Vision analysis and output to on-set monitoring world. What was a request from Netflix was to allow shot-based analysis. Of course, the fact that we can do real-time Dolby Vision means that we are using live analysis, which is happening on every frame. However, if you want the shot-based analysis, you need to, again, calculate the analysis for every frame and then playback the average, right? So this is the latest feature in set of Dolby Vision features in QTAKE. You can switch between live analysis, which happens in real time, and shot-based analysis, which is using the pre-calculated analysis for every frame. There is another mode which doesn't need calculation, but is also useful on the shots where the lighting conditions are changing, and that's a hero frame, right? So in case you have a shot that changes lighting conditions, DP can set one frame as a hero frame, and that frame will be used to supply metadata for the whole shot.